Hey friends, Chapter 10, Section 3, The Golden Age of Muslim Civilization. In keeping with the theme from the last video, I want to acknowledge the gaps in my knowledge and my understanding of Muslim civilization. This is a part of history that I haven't spent as much time with, so I'm making this video acknowledging that, but I'm going to use, or to the best of my ability, use the sources to talk about really how this new religion expanded over a huge amount of territory. Muslim influence and Muslim rule would really come to dominate North Africa, the Middle East, all the way into India, and even parts of Europe as well. Then too. So how were they able to conquer such a huge amount of territory? And also, yeah, first I want to also acknowledge too. I went back to another source and realized I didn't talk about the Kaaba, which was in Mecca. This becomes one of the prior to Muhammad, it was a place where a lot of pagan gods had their um, symbolism enshrined, and then after Muhammad became the prophet of Islam, this became a very very holy center for practicing Muslims. In fact, one of the five pillars of Islam was the Hajj, and this says that all able Muslims should, if they are able to, make a pilgrimage to visit this incredibly sacred place for Muslims too. And I also wanted to go back and say Mecca and Medina. In the last video, I talked about how the Arabian Peninsula was mostly a desert, and that's true, especially on the eastern side over here. But actually, this Medina and Mecca, these were well-connected areas with the broader world then too. So within the Byzantine Empire, and then cities like Jerusalem, they were connected with Baghdad. Lots of traders went down here via the Red Sea and the Nile River. So it wasn't like it was an oasis in and of itself. Like Muhammad grew up and knew about the Byzantine Empire. In fact, I think traveled to maybe parts of the Byzantine Empire and was aware of Christianity. So it wasn't as if to say that Islam was a religion that was born in the desert. That's not really accurate to say. So just wanted to acknowledge that. But how were the Muslims able to conquer such a huge amount of territory? It's a really difficult question, but we can kind of talk about the weakened Byzantine and Sasanian strength. These were the Persians that were here. The Byzantines weren't able to check expanding Arab armies in a way that the Roman Empire had done at the time. Remember, Christianity was suppressed by the Romans for over 300 years until finally it was adopted. But there weren't any major empires to stop the expansion of Islam, of Muslim ideals, in the way that Rome had kind of stopped Christianity for a long time, but there wasn't really anything to stop the spreading of Islam. The promotion of Dar al Islam, which means the abode of submission, the idea that Islam should impact a greater number of people. They talked about jihad, or holy war against enemies. Under Islamic teaching, from my understanding, those who engage in jihad are granted paradise in the afterlife. Money was also a driving factor then too in conquered territories. So the traditional Arab soldiers would definitely be incentivized to take part in it with money. Freedom of religion did kind of exist within the Muslim civilizations then too. Oftentimes they were taxed a little bit more if they were a Christian or a Jew, but it wasn't as if to say that everyone was forced to convert. The expansion of Islam was finally put in check, excuse me, at the battle actually of Tours. Islam was spreading into Europe, and it was at Tours in 732 that a Christian army under Charles Martel defeated the Arabs, and then they were pushed back into Spain. And then there will be wars in Spain that will end in 1492, and eventually the Moors, or the conquering Arab tribes, will be pushed out of Spain. So to make a kind of a silly comparison, I could get to this point on the field to this point in the field, um, unless this big guy was in the way, this Baylor football guy, right? Like this would be like a empire that would restrict the expansion of a new religion, but this didn't exist in North Africa or in the Middle East at the time. So that was one factor that allowed Islam to spread then too. Our text talks about the age of caliphs, or the spiritual successors, and it mentions Harun al Rashid. He became a caliph of Baghdad in 786, And one really cool thing that he did, again, in the Muslim world, like this is a time of enlightenment and cultural advances and literature and science. None of that is really going on in Europe. That's the Dark Ages. And perhaps this gift to a king of Europe named Charlemagne, who we will talk about later this year, this elaborate gift was gifted to Charlemagne, this king from Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad. He gave it to Charlemagne in Europe, and it just shows like the advances that were being um, that were undergoing in this part of the world at the time. He ruled for 23 years, and he maintained perhaps the most elaborate court in the world at the time in Baghdad. That's a subjective question, obviously, but it was very, very lavish then too. He was also a great patron of the arts then too. So his reign, especially, marked some really notable achievements. We'll talk about advances were made in mathematics and medicine and machine and technology in the Muslim world then too. Again, this is their golden age where they are applying knowledge to their understanding of the world in order to improve it. In medicine, there was inoculations against diseases, all kinds of mathematics, machines and wind turbines. I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly. Al-Khwarizmi wrote a text discussing Indian arithmetic. The Arabs were able to borrow from different cultures and advance on certain achievements. There was this concept known as algebra, which I think I pronounced that correctly, but actually I probably didn't. But that later became algebra. That was something that was very much so promoted amongst the Arabs. And then Ibn Sina did something cool. He organized medical knowledge from the Greeks and Arabs. We talked about with the fall of Rome how so much of our understanding of like the Greeks and the Romans was lost, and it wouldn't be discovered until the Renaissance. But Ibn Sina was able to take that knowledge and apply it. There were groups of people known as Sufis who also believed that through prayer they could draw themselves closer to God. Our text mentions this excerpt then here, and then also too in literature too. You can read this quote from Al-Kindi that talks about the Arabs taking knowledge from other people. That's something that a lot of civilizations or cultures of people didn't want to do. They wanted to keep to their own um, insights or knowledge, but the Arabs were open to other contributions then too. And I really like this quote by Omar Khayyam about knowledge and how we learn it too. Um, this only just scratches the surface, but again, if we go back to the first slide, again, everywhere here, and this is a generalization, like this was not an area of the Dark Ages. This is when culture was taking off, when science and medicine and literature were thriving, when the exact opposite was occurring throughout most of Europe during the Dark Ages, if that makes sense. And there's a frowny man. Thanks, friends.